Why do we feel that men need approval? Why do we think that men purposely seek validation and approval to feel better about themselves, to have their egos stroked? Well, there's a fallacy there, and it's not as simple as that. And I want to go into this today for you to help you understand that it's less about approval and validation, and sometimes it is, and that's a human thing when we come from our shadow self, when we come from a wounded, unresolved place. Yes, we seek approval and validation outside of ourselves. We deem ourselves to be worthy based on how other people see us. But why is this a thing for men? Well, it's less about approval and validation and more about intimacy and connection. And let me break this down for you. So firstly, as human beings, as males and females, we actually complement each other. But for some reason, for many reasons, and we do know these, but we're not going to go into that directly today, we don't celebrate differences. We see differences as threatening as opposed to complementary. We, over the years, and I mean years as in terms of hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years, from an evolutionary perspective, but particularly the last, say, 10,000 years, culturally, the way that we've developed, we see differences as a better than attitude. We see that, well, if I'm bigger and stronger than you and I'm physically more dominant, then I'm naturally better than you. If I'm smarter than you, then I'm better than you. If I have access to more wealth or resources than you, then I'm better than you. Now, there's something to be said for all of that. However, we're missing a really important point, that we complement each other. Now, let's focus on the differences for a moment. Hormonally, we're different as men and women. Biologically, we're a little different. Neurologically, our brains a little different. Are we massively different? No. However, these differences, sometimes subtle, sometimes a little more obvious, can play a role in how we do life, how we think, how we feel. That laid with cultural complexity, with the evolution of language in the prefrontal cortex and consciousness and the way that we think about ourselves, the way that we see ourselves, the way that we've been conditioned, some healthy ways, some unhealthy ways. It impacts how we relate. So let's go back to approval and validation in the masculine and or in a male body. From an evolutionary perspective, we were born to prove ourselves. We were born to prove ourselves in our clan, our tribe, our group, our environment, largely for survival. Men were very responsible for extending the perimeter, keeping the area safe, hunting, doing very large, gross or big things in the tribe. And so with that said, we've developed a habit or a pattern, an evolutionary pattern if you wish, a genealogical pattern, a cultural pattern that's been handed down that is very normal to us or very familiar to us to prove ourselves. We are happiest when we are of utility. We feel full. We feel whole when we are of value to others, when we are useful to something bigger and larger than just ourselves. And so the paradox is that sometimes men are considered really selfish, but we're not necessarily really selfish. The way that we act, in part, is driven by this biological need to be of use and utility to those people in our lives that matter to us, to the generations that are coming after us. And once upon a time, and even now in today's world, and I'll give you examples how, once upon a time this was rewarded. This behavior of engaging in something bigger than ourselves was rewarded and reinforced. Let me tell you how. Once upon a time, it was reinforced by, well, if you're able to slay a big beast and eat, or you're able to keep the family safe, that's another day of survival. It's another day of connection. It's another day of living. It's another day of intimacy. Just because the brain wasn't developed as it is now, it doesn't mean there wasn't intimacy and connection. It doesn't mean there wasn't a yearning to be in the in-group and stay in the in-group. That didn't mean that we didn't have this impulse to stay alive and procreate and create and extend the human race. We have this unconscious need within us. So once upon a time it was reinforced. Now, approval and validation in the form of status, wealth acquisition, titles, being seen, celebrating accolades. It's reinforced by people celebrating you. It's reinforced with money or access to resources, power. And so this need to be approved and validated, it's more about intimate connection and bonding. This need for purpose, this need for vision, this need for enacting out into the world what is most important to us, it's core to our male selves. We've honestly evolved this way in different ways. And so when we're speaking to how do we seek approval and validation in a healthy way, that's an important question to ask. And that does begin with, how do we acknowledge ourselves? How do we derive the value that we give to society or to our community, to our families, to our loved ones? How do we define that first and foremost by ourselves? Well, let me give you an unhealthy example. So I read a story once where a man, this is a real story, a man lost his job and he didn't want to let his partner know because he was experiencing so much shame that he lost his job. He considered himself the primary provider. Now, his partner was working as well and contributing basically equally to the relationship. They were both contributing equally to their dynamic, to their family dynamic. However, because of a cultural nuance or ideology or value that he had within himself, when he lost his job, he didn't tell his partner, he lied to his partner. He pretended to go to work every day. And really what he was doing was looking for work. But after a few weeks, he started drinking. He started drowning his sorrows. He just spent time at a park drinking. He was so shameful. That spiraled him more into more shame and more guilt. He had these self-imposed standards to protect and provide, and he couldn't meet them. Now, he didn't want approval and validation to stroke his ego. He did want to feel better about himself, but he was coming from a very unhealthy place. He didn't have a heightened sense of self-worth, because if he did, he'd know that he could go to his partner and say what had happened and know that his worth and his value wasn't completely tied in a job. He didn't even enjoy the job. It was more about these attached values that he had. And so here's an example of many. This is a very common theme. And relationships then start to break down because there's this mistrust. It's perceived as mistrust, but what's really happening is there's a deeper thing going on here where man is so shameful. He's not connected to himself. He has this insatiable appetite, this addiction to external approval and validation in the form of, oh, you've done so well, because he wants to be useful. He wants to be of value and utility. But it comes from an unhealthy place because he doesn't feel safe within himself. He doesn't trust who he is because he hasn't connected intimately with his value and the value that he brings to the world outside of his accolades or his status or his achievements, but rather how he shows up to be of service to people in his own personality, in his own way of giving. And there's this balance point that we must reach of heightened self-worth, not arrogance, because, and this is the interesting thing, arrogance comes at the expense of hurting other people or not being connected to other people. So when we believe in ourselves or over-believe in ourselves or have an inflated sense of self-worth, we want to ensure that we feel good about ourselves at any cost. That's arrogance. Self-worth is bringing to the world your value, trusting that, owning that, being grateful for that, and having healthy moral and ethical conduct, being aware and cognizant of other people in our environment. And so this need for approval and validation, it runs deep. And when we feel supported, when we feel seen, basic human needs being met, this is for men and women, when we feel seen, appreciated, accepted, respected, heard, understood, when these aspects of what we need are fulfilled, we rely less on our external accolades and less on needing to be approved by others because we're having intimate, healthy interactions with those that we love and care for. We're able to speak openly, be vulnerable, be real, share, and feel safe in that sharing. Vulnerability isn't weakness. Vulnerability, when expressed accordingly, when expressed from a place of truth and a place of knowing self, is a beautiful way to bridge the gap between isolation. We're relational beings. We're not meant to be alone. When our vulnerability is leaky, when it's coming from a place of, I need attention because I'm wounded, my little boy is wounded within me and he needs attention. And he's going to do anything he can to get that. Manipulate, be aggressive, oppress, be controlling. That's not healthy. And so we have to flip the script on this. We have to begin to see each other, be compassionate with each other, be empathetic towards each other and with each other and with self. That doesn't mean not setting healthy boundaries. That doesn't mean hating on each other. Not at all. It means honoring self and honoring other. Power and blessings. I'll see you soon.